Welcome to the third installment of the Mycelium Forum, a series devoted to open-ended conversations with occultists, authors and artists. In this episode I am joined by two returning guests. From Finland, Marko Hautala, whose novels blend psychological horror with the liminal and esoteric dimensions, and Arkansas, Matt Cardin, an author and scholar whose fiction and essays probe into the intersections of cosmic horror, philosophy and religion. Together we venture into the dark terrain where creativity converges with psychological transformation. This is the dreaded Chapel Perilous, a liminal state in which consensus reality unravels and unsettling daemonic insights emerge. So, welcome gentlemen. I've invited you here because you're both deeply versed in the liminal phenomena and its manifestations, particularly our main topic today, which is the Chapel Perilous. Matt, you wrote the essay Initiation by a Nightmare, Cosmic Horror and the Chapel Perilous in your collection What the Daemon Said, Essays on Horror Fiction, Film and Philosophy. It's likely the rabbit hole actually that led us to this roundtable discussion. But before we descend further, could you briefly introduce us to the concept of the Chapel Perilous and share how you had a personal encounter with it some decades ago?
Certainly. The idea of Chapel Perilous and the term itself come from Arthurian legend and from the Grail myths associated with the medieval legends and of King Arthur. And actually not quite medieval, early medieval, I guess. And the term refers to a dark and mysterious chapel or church where the quest for the Grail leads the hero, the knight who has been seeking this ultimate spiritual, prize, this ultimate symbol and this ultimate power and blessing. And it was taken up as a metaphor somewhat later. And the place that I became familiar with it was in the writings of Robert Anton Wilson, and he was one of the main authors who brought the idea of it to many people's attention. But it's also been written about by other people, and Terence McKenna was well versed in it. There have been others in the sense that we're probably going to be talking about it here. Chapel Perilous refers not to a physical chapel, and even in the original myth, there certainly is a mythic level to it. In the way we're talking about it, Chapel Perilous refers to a psychological and spiritual and even existential position and state that a person enters, or that enters a person, in which he or she comes to have the very strongly, directly perceived sense or feeling or impression or perception of being in contact with spiritual forces, and perhaps being communicated with by invisible intelligences or just some non-ordinary, higher, transcendent being or intelligence or some kind of influence. And yet, in the most important aspect of Chapel Perilous, and this refers to the liminal aspect, the concept of liminality that we're here talking about, a person in this condition is not just completely under the sway of that impression. A person in this position retains a certain sense of critical and skeptical faculties, and so you can't be sure if, in fact, what you are perceiving as the presence of or the communication from some kind of non-ordinary source is actually happening. It's like your life has come under some massive transformational influence, and yet it's incredibly uncanny because you are well aware that you might be imagining it, you might be hallucinating it, you might just be under the influence of a delusion, or maybe there really is a spiritual source or something that is communicating with you. And it played a big part, this concept, in Robert Anton Wilson's thinking and writing. He himself, in his classic book, Cosmic Trigger, The Final Secret of the Illuminati, talked about Chapel Perilous in the context of a period of his life when he was undergoing what he talked about as a consciously induced brain change. He was attempting to enter altered states and see what could be known with different kinds of state-specific knowledge. And he came into a sense of being psychically communicated with by an intelligence from the dog star Sirius. But he, of course, knew that that might be insane, but it might be happening. And so that was the seed of his own working out of this particular concept. And for me, I was fascinated with it when I started first reading his books when I was in late high school and college. And then right when I was out of college in the early 1990s, I entered into a time of life where I was hit with repeated episodes of sleep paralysis. They were pretty savage attacks, and they weren't just the common experience that many people have of coming to partial awareness during sleep and finding yourself unable to move and feeling panicked. Mine also included what is maybe a more minority experience of very vivid hypnagogic and hypnopompic, I guess you could call them hallucinations, of a demonic presence or a supernatural or preternatural presence, and all kinds of interesting auditory and tactile sensations and thoughts coming into my head. So that initiated me into my own Chapel Perilous experience. My previous life, including my religious life, being raised in an evangelical Protestant Christian tradition, had not involved anything experiential like that. So I was already familiar with the Chapel Perilous concept from Robert Anton Wilson's books when this period of sleep paralysis attacks sort of overturned my view of myself in the world. And I felt like I was losing my mind for a number of years, even as I was living a pretty mundane outward life. So there's the beginnings of an explanation of what we're talking about here.
Yes, thank you, Matt. It's quite uncanny that I also had a sleep paralysis-induced initiation by a nightmare, like yourself, when I was only around 8 years old. And this was a recurring, very extreme sleep paralysis nightmares, which happened when I was so young. And I would add to the list Philip K. Dick, who very obviously had some kind of Chapel Perilous experience himself, and I believe there have been many others. But Marko, I understand you're also familiar with the term, and particularly the archetypal myths behind it. And it appears that many of your stories unfold in some kind of liminal state akin to this Chapel Perilous. Would you like to add your perspective? It's apparent that you're also fascinated with this theme too.
Yeah, I think it's quite central. I don't think there would be horror fiction as such without this idea. So, and that, of course, means that it's kind of general. By the way, first of all, I'd like to say it's an honor to talk with you, Matt. Really admire writing and also I think the best episode of Mycelium Signal podcast is you two talking. I can't remember, maybe 1 year, 2 years ago. But anyway. I think it's something.
Thank you for saying that, Mark.
Yeah, but I really enjoyed also your writing and also your discussions. I've heard you on other podcasts as well. But I think it's so central to it's like katabasis, the idea, and all the initiations, the kind of dark initiations where there's real danger, not the kind of usually. All cultures have some kind of initiation rituals, but usually they are kind of organized in a way that there's no real danger involved. So it's more like suggested. But I think that this idea, it's about the real danger that you could actually, collapse. You could actually go into this. I think what Matt, you were talking about this state where you can't even be sure that it's something supernatural, or is it that you're just hallucination? It's just your imagination. To me, that spells out chaos at the kind of primeval chaos where even your ground is not there. You don't know if you believe in the devil and you meet the devil, you still have the kind of Christian ground on which to stand. But I think this idea has that real danger that you don't even know where you are and something is attacking you. And I think I can't really think of any horror story that wouldn't have this I think as its central theme, in a sense. The simplest slashers might kind of hint at something like this. The final girl in the end has gone through something. But to me, that's something that comes. I can't understand how I could write a story without this theme in it. So it's so basic.
I understand what you're saying.
But I think what is interesting there is that I used to read a lot of James Hillman. Are you familiar, the post-Jungian guy? I used to read so much James Hillman at one point that I haven't really touched him after that. But he had this idea that in these experiences, you should ask who is afraid, who in the psyche is afraid. And his idea was that ego complex, the kind of that part of the psyche that has been trained in convention and socialized, and maybe nowadays the kind of Western rationalist mask that we have, that thing is afraid, and that has to collapse, and then we might move on to something else. I'm saying this because I always feel that there's something positive in the worst nightmares, but I haven't experienced sleep paralysis, so maybe my approach is different. So I have no first-hand experience of that sheer terror of being absolutely helpless and being attacked by something.
Well, I think that for me, the Hillman, if I could say something here, the Hillman connection, or the mention of Hillman, I think that's really apt, Marco. I haven't read nearly as much in him as you have, but I've read some, and I really enjoyed his book, The Soul's Code, which was so popular there for a while, and he very much mainstreamed for a lot of readers, a lot of English-speaking readers, especially the idea of the daimon, or the daimon self, the sort of the intrinsic higher self from the gods, the spirit self attached to a person, as in the ancient Greek myth from Plato and others, and this spirit being what provides the blueprint for your life. It's like your inner guidance system, the thing that enacts your destiny. And when I read that, I was already about 10 years past the worst of my sleep paralysis experiences, and already had been reading about the daimon and the demon, and becoming interested in the history of creativity in relation to these spirits, and that got me thinking very much in the direction of what you're talking about, with Hillman saying we need to ask who's afraid in experiences like this. Because when we talk about the daimon or anything else, as he was, and any of the other things he talked about, like you described, definitely we're talking about we're talking about unconsciously or wittingly having staked out a position in the psyche where we build a boundary, and we enclose that boundary, and not just think of it, but feel it to be the limit of our very identity. And therefore, whatever comes from somewhere else in the psyche, and of course I'm talking here about the Jungian idea of the wholeness of the psyche, feels like it's coming from outside. And whether it's a positive or a negative and a frightful influence, it does feel like it's something else. And that happens in creativity with the sense of inspiration in the muse, and that happens in sleep paralysis with the sense of the attacks that happen there. It even happens with moods that we don't feel like we have control over. But when you talk about Hillman saying that in these experiences, we need to ask, who is it? Who is it that's experiencing this, or who is it that's afraid? I think that's like a golden key to opening up further depths of this, because definitely, if you're feeling fear, you have somewhere, probably unconsciously, marked off a boundary and said, this is where I end, and this is where something that can be considered a threat begins. But in the Hillman scheme of things, and I personally think in the scheme of reality, there is nothing but oneself. And therefore, the very experience that we're talking about can call attention to where we place these limits and can actually open us up to first-person considerations of just where the limits of who we are and what we are lie or don't lie.
Yes, this is very interesting. And it seems like in the very recent psychedelic studies with MRI or some kind of new technologies, they have found out that some psychedelics like psilocybin apparently somehow decrease the activity of some parts of the brain which are responsible for this default mode network. This causes kind of experience of wholeness because all the complexes and all the personal related problems like depression and anxiety kind of wane away, because who would be depressed or anxious if you don't anymore have a persona? You just are like kind of merging with everything, like in the true mystical experience.
Yeah, and I think that kind of rhymes with what Matt has said, that horror in a way comes from the realization, or not realizing, that you're actually kind of painted yourself in a really tight corner. So you think your limits are somewhere, but actually, it's limitless. But that's a horrifying experience. And it's sometimes, this has to do with, I don't know if this is a common experience, but when I meditate, I think I've mentioned this before.
Yes.
Sometimes, this is not like every time, but sometimes kind of when I'm falling deeper, there comes the point where I kind of see distorted images and kind of scary. It's not scary in that state. That's my point. But I see kind of monsters before going deeper, but I'm not afraid of them. And that made me think of kind of, even in kind of church and temple architecture, you sometimes have there are gargoyles and monsters outside. So you have to go through them into the kind of enlightened state or something like that. So if we think that this the Chapel Perilous is a test, it's something like an initiation, that we have to go through it to somewhere else, I think it kind of makes a lot of sense. And it seems that our culture at least wants us to think that way, in a sense. And if you look back at history and all the myths and so forth, and in all cultures as well, of course. But then I sometimes think about the chance of not making it,
Yes.
not pulling through, and it's a really discomforting idea. And I used to work in a psychiatric hospital, and there I saw some cases where it's just this is also rare that it's like this, but the extreme case where your life seems to be kind of pure horror and there's no end to it. So of course that's the thing, that it's uncomfortable to think about that it's not initiation, or it is an initiation, but the danger is real. And that's, I think, also something that maybe horror stories works because of that, because we have that sense also that, it could go wrong. I'm just thinking out loud now. Sorry.
No problem. Very good material. What are your thoughts on this, Matt?
Well, I think it's pretty compelling, what Marko is saying. And that idea of a state or a condition or a universe of just absolute, infinite, eternal, unending, unremitting horror has been something that has fascinated me and frightened me for a long time. And I know exactly what you mean, Marko, about you were talking about having worked in a psychiatric hospital and maybe seeing that be one of the worst, most troublesome impressions maybe that someone who's suffering in there can come under. In terms of the horror fiction that is so important to both you and me, that I realized a while back that in both what I was writing and also in what had drawn me to read it, I was for some reason intuiting the same type of thing, no matter what type of horror movie or horror literature I was reading. This sort of under the surface notion of a backdrop of just absolute horror that sometimes emerges in this type of story or that type of story, and maybe in some kind of meta sense, crossing a bunch of texts, acts as the universal spiritual matrix or the principle behind all of these, works of horror, art, and entertainment. That really drew me. And I don't know, I couldn't articulate to myself why I was fascinated with it. I just knew that I was. That's what I was going after in my own stories. It was what I sensed as maybe the quintessence of that sense of things that made me respond more deeply to the stories of Thomas Ligotti when I first read them in the late 1990s than I had to any other horror fiction. What strikes me more, the more I go on, is that, and I want to put this in the context of the interesting comment you said about the gargoyles and the monsters that appear on the outsides of some churches. And you said, you have to go through them to get to the spirit inside. I think there's I don't know if I'd call it a mistake or an error or an omission or something overlooked in the notion of a universe of infinite horror. I'm not sure how I would put it, but where I have moved in my own thinking and my own understanding and feeling over time is that as long as there is someone horrified, as long as there is a sense of horror, then that thing still isn't absolute, because there is still someone, there's still some center aside from everything to be horrified. This plays back into the sort of mystical and non-dual spiritual literature that I read, and then my own meditative experiences. I started with Alan Watts, as many young people have over decades, and there was Alan saying in several of his books, like, there is no trap if there's no one to be trapped. There is no fate if there's no one to be fated. And that really, and many others have said that. He wasn't the first by far. And if you look at especially the non-dual spirituality, I mean, any mystical spirituality, but I know non-duality has become the buzzword in the past decade or more, even though it's been around for thousands of years. My own direction has definitely become a non-dual spiritual insight path. Definitely, non-duality means not two-ness, not multiplicity, a recognition that really there's only this one thing, and I am this one thing from the inside, not as something that I interrogate or intuit, not like encountering God from the outside. And all experience is just sort of a giant ongoing phantasmagoria of experience, like a big dream. And there can be things that are horrifying. There can be things that are wonderful and delightful and blissful and ecstatic. But as long as there really is any final holding on to any of those and saying, hey, it's all this or it's all that, you are still somewhere positing a boundary and being a separate self. You're not being non-dual because there's something in the total field of experience that is able to do something to something else. And that's like when I first really latched onto it, was actually a long time before I started having my sleep paralysis experiences that I had read Alan Watts talking about that stuff. And I thought, how fascinating. It wasn't until many years later that the actual reality of it began to become clear. And I understood that there's a way out of horror inside horror. That also means there's a way out of bliss inside bliss. But then there's sort of that higher level of equanimity or bliss that exists for something that is just what it is, one without a second, nothing that's erecting a boundary that could have any part of reality affecting in any way any other part, because there are no parts.
That makes a lot of sense. And this, in a sense, you could then think that horror fiction is kind of a reminder, it keeps whipping you until you kind of give in and realize that, if you open up and get out of your kind of small self into a larger one. It can happen, I think, in degrees as well. I'm not saying that horror fiction is the road to non-duality. Probably not. But it can be a kind of a reminder, at least in a kind of banal, everyday sense of existence. Horror is a kind of a shock to the system and reminds you of something. I think when I was a child, I always hated kind of everyday normal life. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy the kind of security that gives, and I had a fairly kind of secure childhood as well. But I remember that horror stories, when I read Poe for the first time, and I was quite young then, I felt a kind of joy from the fact that the horror kind of opens up, rips up the illusion of everyday life. This is my adult self explaining it afterwards, of course. But yes. I sometimes thought that it is something that even the most horrifying story, even as a kid, I felt that it scared me, but it opened up something, kind of promised that this is not it. There's something more. And I think now we are, of course, going to the maybe fantasy does the same to other people. But for me, the horror kind of suggests that there's something else. And I think you could take it to what Matt was saying, the kind of final or ultimate non-dual understanding. But on the way, it's an initiation.
Yes.
And hey, one more thing, interesting thing. Gothic fiction started hand in hand with the rise of the Enlightenment, meaning rationalism and empiricism and all that stuff. And can't remember the name of this scholar who wrote about this, that there is a real connection, that Gothic fiction was a reaction to rationalism. And it doesn't sound like a kind of a really brilliant idea, but when it's really put forward in a kind of a clear way, I think it's fascinating that there is this. And also I think of cosmic horror. It's the horror of now I'm simplifying, of course, it's the horror of the scientific mind when it has to face reality in its vastness.
Oh,
in a way. So that could be it, that there is this development, because of course horrific ideas and horror in fiction was there, of course, but the Gothic fiction itself, and therefore horror fiction, that they would be somehow connected with the rise of rationality. I think it's a fascinating idea anyway.
That's a very good point. Yeah. Go on.
It is.
Yes.
Oh, it is. Well, what you're saying is wonderful there, Marco. A couple of people just come to mind who have talked about that. I mean, there could be one main scholar somewhere. Peter Penzold wrote a classic study of supernatural and horror fiction back in the 1950s, maybe 60s, and he talks about that in there. The modern scholar S.T. Joshi has talked about it. And you said you're afraid you're veering off course of maybe the Chapel Perilous and liminality discussion by this. I don't think at all. I think this actually plays right into it because, there are a lot of different forms that this same theme can take. For example, we all know that Lovecraft is one of the paradigmatic figures in all of cosmic and supernatural horror. And there was this duality in his own sensibility that led him, you might almost say it's a triple sensibility in a way. He had the very self-consciously, fiercely held belief in and posture as a scientific materialist, a science-minded person. And he held to a really strong, 19th century scientific materialist outlook about everything. And his atheism and skepticism were strong and all this. And yet, this is a guy whose strongest imaginative and emotional and creative impulses led him to write supernatural horror fiction and to be one of the founding figures of the modern field of cosmic horror. And along with all that, even though he would say that these are just intimations of the supernatural and so on are just, just ultimately delusions, either just artistic pastimes or for those who believe in them are just complete delusions. He invested a lot of emotional effort in it, and not only in the horror side. He was somebody who was deeply, passionately, intensely moved by scenes of natural beauty like sunsets and architectural vistas, and he could write wonderful little prose poems about beautiful ethereal things, mystical. And then almost imperceptibly, his sensibility shaded over into finding some of the same things horrific. And he's somebody who could say in one of his letters that some of the most poignant and intense feelings he's ever had include the desire to be free of the constraints of physicality and the limitation of the human material viewpoint, and to be able to transcend, and see cosmic vistas. And then go right elsewhere in a letter or in a story about how the very idea of the breaking of natural scientific law by something supernatural is the most horrible thing that anybody can possibly imagine. It would just horrify you beyond belief. He was a bundle of contradictions in this area, but that's like a liminal streak, a vein running right through him. In the end, I think it all goes back to the same thing, that is just facing multiple directions, recognizing the limitation, like we're talking about, the boundary that was set by his rigid egoic self, holding on to this notion of being a rational scientific person living in a material universe that is blind and aimless, and at the same time not being able to escape these impulses that came out in the one way as a fascination and a passion with the supernatural and its horrific aspect, and in the other direction, fantasy and maybe the supernatural or the transcendent in its beneficent and attractive aspect. So he's for me, he's like an exemplar of the ways these things can go. He held no belief in any of the realities of any of his fantastic visions, of course, but then he didn't have to. I think, and nor does anyone have to have any belief in any such thing, literally. I think each of us is actually a fantastic vision of ourselves to ourselves, ultimately. But it's people like Lovecraft and the stories that he wrote, and if you read his letters too, you see it, that can help us understand this stuff coming out in ourselves.
That's brilliant. Yeah, and I think it could be kind of a rule that don't listen to the artist, look at the art. Because there's also, I remember reading an interview with Nick Cave, whom you are probably familiar with, and this is some time ago, I don't know, 15 years ago or something, and he said that he's an atheist when someone asked about his lyrics, because there's lots of kind of biblical stuff and religious stuff in his lyrics. And he said, no, it's just in the songs, I'm an atheist. And I was kind of laughing. I haven't really followed his career lately, but then I saw that he's having conversations with bishops and going to the church now and so forth. So in a way, I kind of thought even back then that, no, you're not an atheist. You're so fascinated about this biblical. I'm not saying that he's a kind of a dogmatic Christian or anything like that, but it was so clear that he was drawn to that imagery that in the end, well, you probably end up kind of, when you get older, you have to deal with that stuff, and you can't pretend that you're something else. So that's brilliant. Lovecraft, the kind of scientific materialist who spends his life writing about these monsters, stuff like that. Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
I think Kenneth Grant didn't he write about that?
Could have. Yeah.
The kind of dual nature of Lovecraft's. I think so. It could be, yeah. But he, of course, had this occult view of him.
Yeah, Grant was, I haven't read a whole bunch of Grant. I always sort of shied away from it. I tried to a couple of times and couldn't get into it. But yeah, he's one of those who, as I understand it, really tried to take it in a literalistic direction in some ways. But hey, that was maybe that's his calling. Each of us has this different way that we're working out sort of you might say, the karma that we've been given.
Yeah, yes. I'm not an expert on Grant either. I've just fairly recently started reading one of its books. Yeah.
Yeah, could we go back a little for the dark illumination topic? And Marco already, I think you already said that I was right that your characters are like pursuing this kind of, or they are kind of like haunted or hunted by the Chapel Perilous. And I think this is a very fascinating topic in the sense that, say, Matt, your aforementioned essay, which I brought up, raises one of the most disturbing questions in the Western esoteric tradition, that what happens when your daimon, your holy guardian angel, your higher self, appears not as a benevolent guide, but as a demonic, assaulting presence. And you describe encounters with sleep paralysis entities that seem to calibrate it specifically for your destruction, and yet these same experiences ultimately led to expanded consciousness and creative breakthrough, and these also seem to be a test of seeker's commitment. Yes.
I think at times I have felt that maybe I missed an early opportunity that was offered to me for some kind of ultimate liberation with my reaction to my inaugural sleep paralysis experience, because as I have described a few times before, it occurred in an interesting way where I'd had some minor versions of it over the years, but I didn't really remember them much until this major one. And I woke up from sort of a dream of lying on the floor in the basement of my house with somebody standing over me, and then woke up into my bedroom, and there was this shadow figure standing over me at the foot of the bed. And I was paralyzed, and there was just you know how it is in a nightmare where things are suffused with a sense of horror and dread. It's not. It's just that it's pure emotion. It's not because of what's happening. It's just what's happening is part of this intrinsic sense of dread and horror. And I couldn't. The experience. I was waking up into another dream, like coming up from a lower level of consciousness. It seemed as if I were waking into wakingness, and there was an actual supernatural event occurring before me, and it was absolute horror. And it was this shadow figure at the foot of the bed that was more like a negative space. It was like it was cut out from space. It wasn't a positive figure. It was a hole in the fabric of, I guess, the space in the room. And it was sucking everything into it, and including me. And I had this instantaneous impression that it was like, it was my doom. It was the absolute annihilation of me. It was sucking me into itself, overdone, absolute destruction of me. And I was horrified, and apparently in my sleep, I started making some kind of noise in the back of my throat and scared my wife to death. And she woke up in bed shaking me and couldn't get me to wake up. And I finally did. I half woke up and thought that she was seeing it too, that it was really there. That's why she was hitting me and shaking me. So it was very traumatic. But later on, as I've reflected on it and thought about spontaneous initiatory experiences, like I talk about in the title and in the text of that essay, it has occurred to me that potentially, if I, this individual, separate, egoic self that I call I, maybe had been at a different place in its experiential journey and had been able to have some degree of equanimity or self-awareness or something in that, I might have been able to just consent to the experience, consent to the horror of that being drawn all the way into that thing and annihilated. And, maybe there would have been a spiritual matter, antimatter convergence right there, and there could have been some egoic collapse or something. I don't know. That could just be fanciful right there. The whole thing just could have been a passing visionary experience, as basically life itself is. But that has occurred to me, that it was a missed opportunity.
Can I ask you, Matt, at the time, did you feel, you used the pronoun it of this shape, but did you, at the time, did you think it was a personality?
Sort of. There was not really a sense of like a personality like I would normally think of a personality there. It was, if I had to describe it, nobody has asked me that specific question before, by the way, so good question. It seemed as if it were definitely some kind of being or an inverse being but that it was just sort of being what it was. Does that make sense? It was just sort of, it was there for me, but there was no like, mind meld, no other mind or intelligence that I could think of. It was more like it was there. It was what it was. It was just radiating, or rather reverse radiating, sucking in everything, including me. And that's what it did. And only it was keyed specifically to my demise. That's what it seemed like.
Yeah, so like a force of nature or something, or kind of.
Yeah. And when I say these things, I mean, part of me wants to say that somebody's going to hear it and start thinking in terms of the Jungian shadow, and kind of reduce it to that model, which is fine. You can talk about these things in different languages. To me, it felt like it would transcend to something like that, but maybe not.
Yeah, I think the shadow concept gets thrown around quite a lot nowadays, so it becomes almost cartoonish in a way. So
yeah, that's kind of what I think.
Yeah.
I think, Matt, you referenced Terence McKenna's insight that the perturbation of consciousness is necessary for us even to become aware of the reality of consciousness as such, like a fish becoming aware of water only when removed from it. So some kind of violent disruption as an ontological shock, which reveals some aspects of reality normally hidden from us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's when I had wondered, kind of wanted to say something, and thank you for bringing it there, Konstantin. Yeah. I wanted to say something just in response to what you were saying, Marco, about horror fiction being an interesting way to wake up, and that goes with McKenna's perturbation of consciousness. If the dream is pleasant, you don't care to wake up from it. You don't want to wake up from it. If the dream of being a self is pleasant, who would want to wake up from it? Marco, you mentioned fantasy, and you said that maybe fantasy, like horror, does some of the same thing. Except fantasy, although it has a dark aspect to it sometimes, can be something that is more pleasant to escape into, just like a romance or something. Horror, definitely, many of us want to escape into it and use it for pure entertainment, and that's fine. But it also is, in its nature, if you're not going for just the roller coaster ride of entertainment, it's something that can get under your skin and trigger actual fear, dread, unease, and that's the state that you're not going to want to, it's something you want to somehow resolve, somehow get away from. Although that can just make you retreat back into whatever sense of yourself, the sense of yourself previously was. I think in this way, horror can also be something that prods us, if we are keyed to receive it that way, towards a deeper contemplation that might lead to some, further, some awakening to the nature of ourselves as selves, as this boundaried self that can be horrified, like we were talking about earlier. So there's something, not just in terms of genre, but in terms perhaps of function for the person, that is a bit different, that is a bit specific to horror.
Yeah, so I think also that the cliche in horror stories, in Halloween and so forth, it's in a really simple form there, that it just doesn't die until you get it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that kind of repetition, and sometimes said that horror fiction is like the art of samsara. You're in the mill and you just keep repeating until kind of you get a realization. I think I really agree. That I think that's well put.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and you wouldn't want to wake up if samsara meant the most beautiful, pleasant dream you could possibly have. You wouldn't want to wake up from it, right? But because it's an absolute, it's an absolute drag, somewhere between dreary and nightmarish and awful, it's something that you're going to be struggling with. And maybe eventually, as you flail about in every possible direction to try and get rid of it, you accidentally happen upon a direction where there really is a crack in the wall, and then you begin to widen that, and the reality beyond it becomes more apparent.
Yeah.
There's something which came to my mind, that like a good example, along with Philip K. Dick's Wallis illumination or epiphany, and speaking of other lived experiences, Carl Jung's confrontation with his unconscious between 1913 to 1917. During this period, he encountered what he called persona number 2, an ancient wise aspect of himself that seemed to possess knowledge beyond his conscious understanding. This culminated in his channeling of the Gnostic text, the 7 Sermons to the Dead, which emerged during a period of intense psychological upheaval. I reckon you both agree that this also sounds suspiciously like Chapel Perilous experience.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yep, he's an interesting case, isn't he? I think that's his Liber Novus, the Red Book. I think that came from that period right there. The fact that he was able to become such a major cultural figure, although he's obviously always more mystical and esoteric in a way, maybe not mystical than Freud, or Adler or anything, but the fact that he was able to achieve such cultural prominence while saying such things and having come from that as kind of his formative experience, I've always found that fascinating. Kind of like Philip K. Dick, he was saying some pretty wild things in Valis and in his novels and in his essays and his speeches and so on, and yet he somehow managed to get away with it. I mean, I think some people thought he was absolutely insane, but anybody that can achieve a place of cultural prominence, even receiving some mainstream attention, lots of it. In the case of those two guys, talking about that, I feel like that's pretty fascinating. It's almost as if reality orchestrates it so that we can hear people saying these oracular things that who otherwise would never be drawn to hear them.
I'm looking at the Red Book as we speak. It's there on my shelf. Yeah, it's an interesting episode. He of course psychologized it himself. Well, he had these 2 personas. The kind of more mystical side was that the person number 2, and then there was the Herr Dr. Jung, which was kind of a pseudoscientific, I think a really boring aspect of Jung. But you can see actually when you read his text which one is speaking. Either it's the more mystical, more interesting side, or it's the kind of pseudoscientific Jung. But I think that's also, although it was a confrontation and maybe trying to kind of integrate these two. I don't know if he really succeeded, because he had these 2 styles in his writing. Of course, it might have been just a practical thing. So when he talked to the general public, he had a different persona. But anyway, it's something that, I had a point there as well. At least it's interesting that this just occurred to me now, that he had these 2 personalities. Wasn't Castaneda's also, there was the tonal and then was Nagual or something, that you have, every person has these 2 aspects. First is the everyday, the mask you show outside, and then there's the deeper self or something like that, and that they should be somehow integrated.
I think it sounds a pretty good idea to try to integrate the 2, or at least recognize that the person number 1 is, of course, a consensus reality interface, which is, of course, needed, but it can become a suffocating mask, too, of course.
Yeah, that's a good point. It can be. I think we all experience that to some degree, right? There's very few of us grow up in an environment that's going to encourage us ever to realize that, it seems like.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this with Konstantin before, but in a way, for me, the most horrifying thing is getting stuck with that person number 1, or I can't remember which order it was, but the kind of dull everyday existence. I think it's monstrous to me. I'm sometimes worried that, because there are days when I kind of lose touch with the inner self, and I think that's the stuff of nightmares, because I have that I kind of have the intimation that how far this could go, and you would be you just have to get wasted every night and trying to desperately look for some kind of, and that's, I don't know why, but maybe it has to do, because I said that as a child I kind of had a problem with the kind of routine everyday life and the kind of that like the grown-ups were telling me. I was in a working class environment where it was really practical, and you should do this and this and this, and you can read those books, but it's not really important, and so forth. But that's also a Chapel Perilous for me. I remember when I was still had a day job, there I had these moments. Although I liked the people and everything, nothing wrong with that, but there was this, I could describe it almost as horror, kind of the lack of death of imagination, and the kind of death element in everything. And you start to see just the stuff that's in front of you and so forth.
When you talk about that, you suddenly I flash on Ligotti's Tales of Corporate Horror, which
that my work is not yet done.
Model of this one. Oh yeah, and a few others. Our Temporary Supervisor, and then there's some others. Yeah, those are something about like what you're talking about. And then if in fact this outer, outward facing personality, you called it the interface, Konstantin. I love that.
Yes.
If you're totally immersed in that to the point where you might even talk about refer to the second century Gnostic concept of being hypnotized or asleep, anesthetized by this self, then you get the possibility, which takes us back to Chapel Perilous again, of maybe your daimon or your demon self, something that is also you, but that comes to you seemingly other, but instead of coming from what seems to be objective and external, it comes from somewhere inside, or maybe in the form of strange synchronicities that start to come up. And then there's a triple layer going on, the outer self, the shell that you can sort of pretend to be, and then your center of perceived identity, and then behind or above or within that, some sort of envoy from the wider plenitude of your total self that may appear as a figure speaking to you, or maybe just a sense of being driven or sensitized in a certain way. I think Jung referred to his as Philemon or Philemon, right?
Yes.
I never have named mine, but the idea of the demon or the demon muse and its function and reality, regardless of what status one assigns to it, I leave it liminally myself. That's why one reason Chapel Perilous is so important to me. The concept. I don't believe in my demon or my daimon muse, and don't disbelieve in it as a literal reality. It's kind of like a perfect metaphor, a living metaphor. There's something that is, my spiritual self that is not the I that feels itself to be the ego that's speaking to you right now. And that's not something that came from outside. That's something that's like the fish becoming aware of water because of those Terence McKennian perturbations of consciousness. I sort of woke up too at some point and realized, oh my gosh, there's been this sort of flavor that has infused my entire life, or there's been this base note below the level of conscious awareness, or however you want to put it, that has been infusing, threading itself throughout my life. And that's like this one central guiding theme. And it feels like it's beyond me, but by its very nature, it really has to be me. So this is, I think, can come to us as something that shakes us awake, even when outer conditions are things that are conspiring to keep us asleep.
Yeah, that's great. The kind of, you said flavor that kind of has infused in you, and how did you put it? You don't believe in it, but you don't do. How do you say that?
It's almost like
in between.
Yeah, how Jung, in fact, when it came to God, remember he said he didn't believe in God. How did he put that? He said just something, just like I know, right? And he was using God in a different way, maybe than the churches would use it.
Probably,
but
yeah.
It's like a knowledge that there's no belief involved. It precedes belief. It's like
exactly.
It transcends that category of something I can believe in or something I cannot believe in, because it actually is part of the you who would be projecting the attitude of belief or disbelief to begin with.
Yeah.
I think this is a good segue to creative fire or the diamond muse. And Marco, you have said before that when you write, you seem to have this invisible audience. You call it the shadow folk to give you company. And speaking of inner creativity, Jung himself viewed it as an autonomous force that can completely dominate an artist's life. The creative process seizes human being and makes him its instrument, and often demanding everything at the expense of personal happiness and stability. So are you familiar with this kind of overwhelming, almost possessive force, or some kind of dimension, or kind of how would you, like a channel in a radio that you tune into, and it kind of just like washes over you, and you are in this kind of daimonically inspired state for, say, months, and then you just, after the work is done, you just lay back and you are perplexed that what the hell just happened, you know?
Yeah, only wish I could just tune into that,
Yeah.
but I can't. Sometimes I have to just work my way into, and it takes a lot of time. But yeah, I think every artist, every writer, every painter knows that sometimes you don't know what the hell you're doing,
Yeah.
but it's great, and you really feel that it's not this banal me doing this, that this just comes from somewhere. It's fairly rare. Sometimes I don't know what, maybe 5 pages or something like that is the maximum that I've written in that state. So you don't necessarily have to change anything, only the typos or something like that. So it happens. So, and this the shadow folk you talked about, yeah, that's a feeling when my writing is really intense, and usually when I'm at a small cottage in the archipelago here, where I sometimes go in the wintertime to write. There, when the writing is really intense, and then you stop, and for a second you kind of realize that there was an audience here. And it's a really strange feeling. Right away, when you start to pay attention to it, it kind of disappears. But there is the sense that there are people, and it's many people. It's not one. So I don't know how this fits in with the kind of diamond thing, but there are people there. I said they're an audience. I don't know what the hell that is, but maybe I kind of feel that I'm not writing for my real audience, that I'm writing for them when I'm really, really inspired. So these practical things, thinking about the real audience, they come later. That's a more superficial state in a way. But yeah, of course, I think I'm not unique in any way in this. I think all artists and writers have the sense that they're channeling. I think that's almost like a cliche, but at some point it was kind of embarrassing to talk about it. At least in Finnish literary circles,
Yeah.
It became something that, okay, it's not, of course you are kind of rationalizing things and inventing events and so forth. Of course, that's part of it. But the kind of core of the whole business, I think it's that that's why I do this. If I do it for the money, I would be an idiot. So it's just trying to tune into that kind of, you call it the creative fire, something like that. That kind of makes life worth living in a sense.
I find that fascinating. I love the way you put that, Marco.
Thank you.
What do you think, Matt, about what Margot just said, that in the context of, for example, Ian McGilchrist, we spoke about him. I think he was a brain researcher, and he had this book, The Master and the Emissary. For if you think of this phenomenon clinically, which I think you can definitely do, but I think also there's this metaphysical levels to the diamond, of course. And I think that if you have a fruitful and most unhindered access to your different levels of your psyche, that is a very much of a benefit to the artist and the philosopher and the author, don't you think?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And McGilchrist, I mean, his model is is wonderful, and clearly he has captured a lot of people's attention and gained I think a deserved degree of notoriety for his grace and his intelligence in speaking about those things. I mean, I assume most of your audience, most of the people listening to this particular conversation, will be familiar with the master and emissary model, which was a great carrying forward of the old idea of the right brain, left brain, splits and the different functions, but much more sophisticated. And with the right brain, the right cerebral hemisphere being in his model, what should have been the place from which we live and see and where our motivations come from, with its holistic view of everything and its sort of poetic, mythic understanding of things, and the left brain properly being its emissary that would actually, enact things in the practical world. Of course, he said what he says, and it's a great way to look at the problem that has occurred, I think, culturally throughout the world, is that it's gotten out of whack, and the emissary tries to be the master, and therefore we get the denatured, disenchanted, reductive, materialist, ultimately nihilistic view of things, not realizing that we actually have access to the other within ourselves. But within the context of what Marko was talking about, I mean, the McGilchrist model would say that when something like that flow state that you're getting into, Marko, happens, that you're sort of firing on all cylinders, you might say, and that's you're harmonized within those two aspects of yourself. The how many different metaphors can we bring in? The Apollonian self and the Dionysian self.
Yeah.
The rational brain and the non-rational, the pre-rational brain, or yourself as ego self, and your daimon muse, speaking. It just sounds to me like it's an alignment state that happens, and I'm familiar with it, not in the same way that you describe it. I am familiar with writing and realizing that coming to awareness after I've been in a really intense flow like that definitely I have been calibrating to a perceived audience, kind of like my ideal reader or something like that. But what you describe about the sense of there actually having been an audience, and that the audience of people, of other individuals who will actually end up being your readers, being just completely secondary, I haven't experienced to that. I think that would be pretty fascinating to experience, and I'm very interested to hear about it.
Yes, maybe it has to do with being alone for days and not talking to anyone. So it might be that there's that element to my writing method, that I don't even call my wife, I just send a message or something. So
Right.
when I'm not communicating, so I don't know, maybe it kind of makes it that your brain starts to, okay, now I'm rationalizing it. Now my brain starts to create people, because there hasn't been any people for days. So I don't know, but I really like that. And when I started to think about that as the main audience, it kind of clicked. That I felt, yeah, that's the main audience. Then when I meet people who said they read my work, I'm kind of, okay, I'm like a little bit surprised that, okay, there is this real audience, not a huge one, but then there is that audience as well. And by the way, I also really love McGilchrist. I've read Master and His Emissary, but he's got this new book, The Matter with Things, but it's more than 1,000 pages. So I'm listening to a podcast series where he discusses each chapter. So I was a bit intimidated about the 1,000 pages, and first sections are about neurology. But I agree with you, Matt. He's really nuanced about this. It's not reductionist at all, although he's doing the hard science bit there as well. So he's really brilliant and kind of courageous, because he took an idea that had been kind of vilified in a sense, because this left brain, right brain thing had been popularized in a kind of naive way some decades ago. So after that, nobody wanted to have a look at that, but he brought it up again and had this more nuanced approach to the whole thing. And I think it's kind of intuitively makes a lot of sense for I think all creative people. Even though like I just have to believe when he's talking about the neurology. I don't know enough about that, but I agree. He's onto something, definitely.
Mm-hmm. He is, and the duality of the principles involved when he's talking about left brain, right brain. It's so wonderful that he was able to reclaim that from what we're talking about from the sort of the several decades of disrepute because of simplified popularizing approach that had been taken to presenting that. Because as you well know, having read the book, it all lines up very well with very core important principles like heaven, earth, and the yang and the yin, and just many other things. The sort of the mystery of generativity of rational and unconscious processes, and the male and the female, and so on and so forth. It's just a brilliant presentation. I'm thinking this for the first time as I'm rambling on here. It would be interesting to see or hear someone do any kind of further applicability of it to the type of thing that we've been talking about here, sort of the specific topic of liminality, the specific topic of unease or cosmic horror, and see what you could derive from what he's talking about, both for the self and for the world, what you could derive as a way of further illuminating the themes that we're talking about here. I certainly don't feel up to that, but I would read it if someone came up with it.
Yeah, definitely. Yes, I don't think he talks about kind of feelings of horror so much. So, but I'm sure that approach would work there as well.
Well, maybe one of us can identify someone and convince them to do it.
Yeah.
I might be able to get someone on the podcast to talk about this thing, which is very fascinating. And it also came to my mind that I think Bukowski said that right drunk, edit sober. So there you have it.
Yeah. And by the way, one more thing about McGilchrist and Jung. I think when McGilchrist talks about the left brain mentality, it's kind of... Jung had this expression, the Western mind is a madhouse of abstractions. And I think the left brain thinking would be something like that. So it's completely crazy, but it can rationalize its odd behaviors and odd ideas and the reasons why it's blocking most of the stuff out and keeping to its kind of rigid models. I think Jung was onto that, although of course he didn't talk about that, or couldn't even at that time have the kind of neurological understanding of it.
And that's one of the cool things about a McGilchrist, right? When they come along, and it's kind of he sort of restates a number of things, and of course breaks new ground as well in a way that, like you're saying, you can read resonances of it in other people previously and in other ways of talking about it, and realize that you've sort of got a unified statement that draws many different strands together. It's pretty fascinating to observe it happening. And again, like I said, the fact that he has become so popular, and that he is a popular podcast guest, and if you see him if you see that he's been on a podcast, you can know that at the very least it's going to get tens of thousands of listens or views. That's amazing to me, because I am perhaps sometimes too cynical, I don't know, about the center of gravity and what might, and that elusive, non-existent type of person, the average human being, the average person, and what level of interest they may have in anything like this. It's easy for me to go off into plenty of cultural critiques about dumbing down and the technological Ray Bradburyan Fahrenheit 451 type world that we live in, and so on and so forth. But apparently that's not entirely true, because you have people like him and some others that are really commanding attention. There's clearly a hunger for this type of insight.
I think so. That what we see on social media and so forth, I think that's just the surface. I think there's a hunger to get back to the topic, Chapel Perilous, the kind of those initiation experiences. I think it's there, and people are looking for them. They might be looking for them in the wrong places sometimes, and that's the scary part. If the culture doesn't offer them, but I think there is, we are not as dumbed down as I also sometimes feel that. There are maybe 500 people thinking in the world at this point. So I think there are more people, and for example, this podcast, there probably are a lot of people listening to it.
Mm-hmm. And that's what you find when you attempt to treat people en masse as that level of dumbness. Whether you are believing it because you're despairing over it, or whether you're trying to exploit it, right? Eventually, something just innate, I think, does come out, like this fascination with things, whether good or bad. Jordan Peterson became such a phenomenon for a while, and there are many people who criticize him, and maybe there are many valid criticisms of him, but still that goes back to the same hunger among everyone or certain groups of people for something actually life-giving, something that's going to speak to each of us. Remember how, have you ever read Paul Tillich, the 20th century Protestant theologian? You know who I'm talking about?
No.
Paul Tillich was a major figure in religious philosophy in the 20th century. He was I believe, a German theologian who then came to America. And actually, he had a lot of stuff to say about the daemonic in religion, the Daemonic, demonic, that might be of interest to you. But one of the most famous terms and concepts that came out of his books and writing was ultimate concern. And he was famous for saying that he tried to come up with what I think is an effective way of talking about a commonality of interest that we all have, whether we are self-consciously religious or spiritual in our beliefs, or or anti-religious or spiritual, or wherever we come from. Each of us has this realm of ultimate concern that deals with actual, pressing, inescapable, a sense of need, a need for orientation, a sense of importance. It's not something we've chosen, right? It's something that, if we're being honest with ourselves, this is the area of ultimate importance for us, for our lives. And it goes back to basic fundamental questions like, why am I here and what am I supposed to do now that I find myself awake in apparently in a world as this person, that kind of thing. He said all of us have this ultimate concern, the area of ultimate concern that we're given, and that is something that, if we will really focus on it, we can find a degree of commonality among ourselves that we would otherwise be prevented from seeing if we just focused on our surface level beliefs.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to look that up. Paul Tillich.
Tillich.
Yeah, thank you.
Fascinating. I think this is a good point to wrap up this panel discussion in the Mycelium Forum, a special episode of Mycelium Signal podcast. And thank you, Matt and Marko, for joining us today. Good night.